In 1868, a Chinese railroad laborer named Wei Liang, working for Union Pacific in the Nevada desert, discovers that the official bridge survey maps filed with the federal government contain systematic falsifications, distances inflated, terrain misrepresented, construction costs fabricated. Over 18 months, Wei secretly records the true measurements inside hollow iron spikes he personally forges, hiding 31 accurate bridge locations across 400 miles of track. When a federal land grant inspector arrives to verify the filings, Wei's spikes are the only accurate record in existence. Union Pacific executives move quickly to destroy the evidence. The spikes vanish, but not before one man carries the truth out of the desert on his back. The spike hit the rail with a sound like a gunshot. It was the kind of sound that meant nothing to anyone on the crew except the man swinging the hammer. To the foreman walking the line with their clipboards and pocket watches, every spike sounded identical. A clean iron ring, followed by silence, followed by the next one. 40 spikes per rail length, 400 rail lengths per mile. The mathematics of the Transcontinental Railroad were designed to make individual labor invisible, to transform men into units of output measured in feet of track per day. The foremen did not need to know names. They needed numbers. Wei Liang had been driving spikes for 14 months when he first noticed the discrepancy. It was a Tuesday in late October 1867, somewhere in the high desert east of Elko, Nevada, where the temperature dropped below freezing at night and the alkali flats cracked underfoot like old porcelain. The crew had been laying track across a dry wash for 3 days, following survey stakes that had been placed by Union Pacific engineers the previous spring. The stakes marked the approach to Bridge Number 7, a timber trestle crossing a seasonal creek bed that ran perhaps 40 feet across at its widest point during spring snowmelt, and bone dry for 9 months of the year. Wei knew this crossing. He had crossed it on foot dozens of times carrying equipment. He knew the distance between the eastern and western banks the way he knew the weight of his own hammer, not from a document, but from his body. The survey stake on the eastern approach was marked 210 feet. Wei stopped walking. He set down his tool bag. He looked at the stake, then looked at the creek bed, then looked at the western bank. He counted his steps across. He counted them again. He was not an educated man in the American sense. He had never attended a school, never studied formal geometry, but he had grown up in Guangdong province, helping his father measure irrigation channels, and he understood distance the way carpenters understand level, instinctively, physically, without needing to think about it. The crossing was 110 feet, perhaps 115 on the widest diagonal, not 210. He said nothing. He picked up his tool bag and kept walking. That night, in the canvas tent he shared with 11 other men from his home province, Wei sat with a piece of charcoal and drew the creek bed from memory on the inside of a flour sack. He marked his own measurement. He marked the official measurement from the survey stake. He stared at the two numbers for a long time. Then he folded the flour sack and tucked it under his sleeping mat and said nothing to anyone. The Chinese workers on the Union Pacific line occupied a specific and carefully maintained position in the social architecture of the Transcontinental Project. There were approximately 10,000 of them by 1867, comprising nearly 90% of the Central Pacific workforce and a significant portion of Union Pacific's labor in the Nevada and Wyoming territories. They were paid $26 to $35 per month, roughly 30% less than Irish laborers performing identical work, and they were responsible for the most dangerous assignments on the line: drilling into granite with hand tools, handling nitroglycerin in temperatures that made the compound unpredictable, descending cliffs in wicker baskets to set explosive charges. They built the railroad. They did not own shares in it. They did not attend the celebration at Promontory Summit. Most of them were never photographed. Fewer than 200 of their names appear in any Union Pacific employment record that survives today. Wei Liang's name does not appear in any of them. What he had noticed at Bridge Number 7 was not an isolated mistake. He began to understand this slowly across the following weeks, as the crew moved east through the desert and he continued to measure distances with his feet and his memory. Bridge Number 9, crossing a rocky gulch near the Utah territorial line, officially surveyed at 340 feet. Wei's count, 190 feet. Bridge Number 12, a low timber crossing over an alkaline pond that the engineers had classified as a permanent water feature, requiring reinforced pilings. The pond was seasonal, barely 60 feet across, and the reinforced pilings had never been installed despite appearing in the materials manifest. Bridge Number 14. The survey listed a granite canyon crossing requiring 180 tons of timber framing. The canyon was there. The granite was there. But the timber framing in place weighed, by Wei's estimate, perhaps 60 tons, and the remainder had been recorded as installed, signed off by 2 separate Union Pacific inspectors, and billed to the federal government. By December 1867, Wei had documented 8 discrepancies. By March 1868, he had documented 17. He was not looking for a pattern. The pattern found him. The Transcontinental Railroad was the largest public works project in American history up to that point, and it was also the largest financial fraud. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. The federal government had agreed in 1862, under the Pacific Railway Acts, to grant railroad companies between $16,000 and $48,000 per mile of completed track, depending on terrain difficulty, plus land grants of 10 square miles for every mile of track laid. The more difficult the terrain, the higher the payment. The more miles certified as complete, the more land transferred. This created a powerful incentive not merely to build quickly, but to misrepresent what had been built. A bridge crossing of 110 feet, billed as 210 feet, represented nearly double the material costs, and therefore nearly double the federal reimbursement. Multiplied across hundreds of crossings, dozens of tunnels, and thousands of miles of graded roadbed, the numbers became staggering. The instrument through which much of this fraud was executed was a construction company called Credit Mobilier of America. It had been created in 1864 by the same men who owned Union Pacific, a legal fiction that allowed the railroad's directors to pay themselves through the construction company at dramatically inflated rates for work that was either not performed or performed at a fraction of the stated cost. By 1872, a congressional investigation would reveal that Credit Mobilier had paid out approximately $23 million in fraudulent profits, in an era when the average American worker earned less than $500 per year. Shares in the company had been quietly distributed to at least a dozen sitting members of Congress, including the sitting Vice President of the United States. ensuring that oversight committees remained cooperative. Wei Liang did not know the name Credit Mobilier. He did not know the names of the men in the New York offices who were collecting the profits. He knew only what his feet told him, and what his eyes told him, and what the growing collection of numbers on flour sack paper told him when he laid them out at night in the tent. By March 1868, he had documented 17 bridges with falsified survey measurements, representing a combined overclaim of approximately 1,400 feet of crossing distance, enough at federal reimbursement rates to account for more than $90,000 in fraudulent government payments. He needed somewhere safer to put the numbers. Wei had learned to work iron from a man named Chen Baoshi, who had been a village blacksmith in Fujian province before emigrating to California in 1852. Chen was 61 years old, partially deaf from decades of hammer work, and he ran a small portable forge that traveled with the construction crew, used primarily for sharpening drill bits and replacing damaged track hardware. On winter evenings when work had stopped, Chen repaired tools by firelight and occasionally accepted small commissions from the crew: a repaired belt buckle, a strengthened axle pin, a piece of bent rail reshaped into a hinge. He was not a Union Pacific employee in any formal sense. He was an independent contractor whose services the company tolerated because replacement hardware took weeks to arrive from the supply depots in Omaha. Wei approached Chen on a cold evening in early April 1868 with a specific request. He wanted to learn to cast hollow spikes, standard track spikes in external appearance, identical in head shape and shank diameter to the thousands of spikes driven into the roadbed every day, but with a narrow internal channel running 3/4 of the length of the shank. The channel would be sealed at the tip with a thin iron plug, also cast by Chen, that could be removed and replaced with a small tool. Inside the channel, a tightly rolled strip of paper, thin enough to be compressed into a cylinder no wider than a man's finger, could be stored indefinitely, protected from moisture by a thin coating of beeswax applied to the paper before insertion. Chen listened to this request for a long time without speaking. Then he asked one question. "If they find these, will they come for me?" Wei said, "They won't find them. They're looking at the survey maps. Nobody looks at the spikes." Chen thought about this for 3 days. Then he began teaching Wei how to cast iron. The process was not simple. Standard track spikes in 1868 were cut spikes, square-shanked iron fasteners approximately 5.5 inches long, produced in enormous quantities at rolling mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and shipped west by the carload. They were not cast individually. They were stamped from iron bar stock using mechanical dies. To produce a hollow spike that would pass visual inspection required casting each one separately in a sand mold, finishing the exterior to match the stamped appearance of the standard product, and drilling the internal channel with a hand brace after the casting had cooled. Each spike took approximately 40 minutes to produce. A standard crew member drove between 400 and 500 spikes per day. Wei was not trying to replace the standard spikes. He needed only enough to hold a record. Over the following 6 weeks, working in the pre-dawn hours and occasional evenings when the forge was available, he produced 31 hollow spikes, one for each falsified bridge crossing he had documented or expected to document before the Nevada survey was complete. each spike was slightly heavier than a standard spike by approximately 2 ounces, a difference imperceptible during normal handling. Each was stamped on its head with a small mark, a single horizontal scratch across the top of the square head, made with a cold chisel, that Wei could identify in a pile of hardware, but that a foreman would never notice or recognize. He drove them into the roadbed himself, in specific locations he memorized, always on the northern rail, always at the eastern approach to each bridge crossing, always the third spike from the joint. 31 spikes, 31 bridges, 31 rolled paper records of the true measurements, sealed in beeswax inside hollow iron. He drove the last one on a Thursday morning in late May 1868, somewhere east of the Humboldt Sink, in a stretch of desert so flat and featureless that the only landmarks were the telegraph poles strung alongside the grade. He set the spike with 3 strokes of the hammer. He had learned to feel the moment of full seating through the handle, a slight softening of the impact as the iron found resistance. And then he stood up and looked east along the rails toward Utah, where the 2 lines were converging, and said nothing. No one was watching. No one ever watched the man driving the spike. The federal land grant inspector arrived at the Union Pacific's Nevada Division headquarters in Elko on the 14th of June, 1868. His name was Harold Fitch. He was 34 years old, a former surveyor from Ohio who had been appointed to the General Land Office the previous year. He had been sent to verify bridge construction specifications across a 200-mile section of the Nevada line, a routine audit triggered not by any suspicion of fraud, but by a procedural requirement written into the 1866 amendment to the Pacific Railway Act. Inspections like this had been conducted twice before on other sections of the line. Both previous inspections had found no significant discrepancies. Both previous inspectors had been entertained at company expense during their visits, housed in the Union Pacific's private rail car, and returned to Washington with complete documentation provided by the company itself. Fitch was met at the Elko Depot by a Union Pacific Division superintendent named George Alston, who welcomed him warmly and immediately offered him the use of the company's surveying equipment, the company's horses, and the company's documentation files. Alston explained that the company's own engineers had already prepared a complete set of verification measurements for Fitch's review, which would save considerable time in the field. Fitch accepted the hospitality. He accepted the horses. He declined the pre-prepared measurements. He wanted to take his own. Alston's expression did not change. He said he understood completely, and that the company would of course provide whatever assistance Mr. Fitch required. That evening, Alston sent a telegram to the Union Pacific offices in Omaha. The message, reconstructed from surviving company correspondence, read in part, "Inspector more thorough than previous. Recommend immediate review of Nevada bridge files. Anticipate complications at crossings 7 through 14. The response arrived the following morning. Handle locally. Do not let inspector reach the grade unsupervised. Wei Liang learned about the inspector from a foreman named Doyle, who mentioned it while assigning the morning work crews. In the offhand way that foremen mentioned things they did not expect the Chinese workers to understand or care about. A government man had come to look at the bridges. The crews should work normally and answer no questions unless directly addressed by a white man in a suit. Wei understood every word. He spent that evening sitting outside the tent in the cold, looking at the stars, thinking through a problem that had no obvious solution. He had 31 spikes in the ground across a 200-mile section of track. The information inside them was accurate. The inspector needed that information. But Wei had no way to approach an official government representative. No language to explain what he had done. No credential that would cause a white federal employee in 1868 to stop and listen to a Chinese laborer who was pointing at a railroad spike and claiming it contained evidence of fraud. He had approximately 72 hours before the inspection team moved through the section where most of the spikes were concentrated. After that, the inspector would leave, file his report based on whatever documentation Union Pacific chose to provide, and the fraud would remain buried in the ground in 31 hollow iron cylinders that no one would ever look for because no one knew they existed. Wei sat in the cold for a long time. Then he went to find Chen Baosher. The forge was cold. Chen Baosher had not lit it that evening, which meant he had finished his repair work before sundown. Unusual for a man who habitually worked until the last light was gone from the sky. Wei found him sitting on an overturned water barrel outside the equipment tent, smoking a pipe he rarely touched, except when something was troubling him. The old man looked up when Wei approached, but said nothing. He gestured at a second barrel with the stem of his pipe, and Wei sat down. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Around them, the camp settled into its nighttime rhythms. The distant clatter of cookpots, the low murmur of conversation from a dozen tents, the occasional metallic complaint of the telegraph wire strung along the grade, vibrating in the desert wind. Somewhere to the east, a coyote called once and received no answer. Wei said, "The inspector is here." Chen drew on his pipe. "I heard. He's going to measure the bridges." "I heard that too." Wei looked at the ground between his feet. The alkali soil was white in the moonlight, cracked into polygonal plates, like old ceramic. If he uses Union Pacific's measurements, he finds nothing. If he measures himself, he might find the differences. But he doesn't know what he's looking for. He doesn't know the pattern. He'll measure one bridge, find a discrepancy, assume it's a surveying error. He'll measure two, think it's a calibration problem with his instruments. He needs all 31. He needs to see them together, in sequence. That's the only way the pattern is visible. Chen was quiet for a moment. "And you think you can give him that?" "I think I have to try." The old man set down his pipe on his knee and looked at Wei with an expression that combined something like respect with something like exhaustion. He had been in America for 16 years. He had watched men try to correct powerful institutions before. He knew how those attempts usually ended. Not with violence most of the time, but with invisibility. The attempt simply disappeared. The man making it disappeared. The institution continued. "They will not let you near him," Chen said. "I know. And if somehow you reach him, if he listens, they will say you fabricated everything. A Chinese laborer with no name in any record, claiming to have evidence against the company that employs him. Who does the government believe?" Wei said nothing for a moment. Then, "The spikes don't lie. Iron doesn't lie. The measurements are inside the iron. If he pulls the spikes and reads what's inside, the numbers speak for themselves. He can verify every one against his own measurements. I don't have to be believed. The iron has to be believed." Chen picked up his pipe again. He smoked in silence for a long time. Then he said, "There is a man, a translator. He works for the telegraph office in Elko. His name is James Fong. He speaks English like a lawyer. He has worked for white men for 11 years, and they trust him because he has never given them a reason not to." Wei waited. "He owes me a debt," Chen said. "He is an honorable man. He remembers debts. Nothing large, a repaired wheel axle 2 winters ago, but would he carry a message to the inspector?" Chen thought about this. Is a different question. He would carry a message to anyone, whether anyone receives it. James Fong was 38 years old, born in Sacramento to parents who had arrived in California during the gold rush of 1849. He had grown up speaking English alongside Cantonese, had taught himself to read and write through a combination of church school attendance and self-study, and had worked for the Western Union Telegraph Office in Elko for 4 years, translating Chinese language messages for the railroad crews and occasionally serving as an informal interpreter for Union Pacific's labor supervisors. He was not a powerful man, he was not a wealthy man, but he occupied a narrow corridor of social legibility that most Chinese men in Nevada in 1868 did not. He was known by name to white officials, trusted with written communications, and capable of walking into a government office without being turned away at the door. Wei met him at the telegraph office at 7 in the morning, 2 days before the inspection team was scheduled to reach the main concentration of falsified bridge crossings. He had walked 4 miles through the pre-dawn desert to get there, arriving before the office opened, waiting on the wooden steps with his tool bag in his lap and his hat pulled low against the early cold. Fong listened to Wei's account for 45 minutes without interrupting. He asked 3 questions. How certain was Wei of his measurements? How many spikes were in the ground? Was anyone else aware of what Wei had done? Wei answered, certain enough to have staked his life on them, which he recognized he might be doing. 31. Only Chen Baoshi, who would deny everything if asked. Fong was quiet for a long time after that. He looked out the window of the telegraph office at the main street of Elko, where a Union Pacific freight wagon was being loaded with timber sections 40 yards away. 2 company supervisors stood near the wagon talking. One of them glanced at the telegraph office window and looked away. "You understand," Fong said carefully, "that if I take this to Inspector Fitch and he dismisses it, or if Alston finds out before I reach Fitch, neither of us is protected by anything. There is no law I can cite. There is no official body that specifically protects a Chinese laborer who accuses Union Pacific of fraud. The 1866 Civil Rights Act does not cover this situation. The Labor Bureau does not have jurisdiction in this territory. We would be 2 Chinese men who made a serious accusation against a major railroad corporation, and the most likely outcome would be that we lose our positions and are escorted to the territorial boundary." Wei said, "I know. And you want me to do it anyway." "I want you to decide," Wei said. "I've already decided." Fong looked at him for a long moment. Then he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and said, "Tell me which bridge is first." Harold Fitch had been measuring things professionally for 11 years, and in that time, he had developed a reliable instinct for when numbers were wrong. It wasn't a sophisticated instinct. It didn't require advanced mathematics or specialized instruments. It was the same instinct that any careful man develops after years of comparing what documents say against what the physical world contains. Documents said a room was 12 feet wide. His tape measure said 11 feet 4 inches. Documents said a bridge crossing was 340 feet. His surveying chain said 190 feet. The discrepancy itself was not surprising. Errors happened in field surveys, especially in difficult terrain. What was surprising was the direction of the error. In his experience, surveying errors were random. Sometimes a measurement came in high, sometimes low. Natural variation, instrument calibration, human fatigue. But across the 7 bridges he had personally measured in his first 3 days in Nevada, every single discrepancy ran in the same direction. Every official Union Pacific measurement was higher than his own. Not by a consistent factor. The inflation varied from 40% to nearly 100%, but always, without exception, upward. 7 bridges, 7 overclaimed distances. The probability of that pattern occurring by random surveying error was, by Fitch's rough calculation, less than 1 in 100. He had not yet written this down in his official report. He was still deciding what it meant. On the evening of his 3rd day in the field, back in his quarters in Elko, a private room at the company's guest house, a courtesy he had accepted without thinking and was now beginning to regret, he found a folded piece of paper that had been slipped under his door. There was no name on the outside. The handwriting inside was precise and careful, the English slightly formal in the way of a man who had learned the language from books rather than conversation. The note read, "Inspector Fitch, you are measuring the right things. You are not yet measuring them in the right sequence. There are 31 bridge crossings in this section with falsified survey records. The true measurements of all 31 are stored in physical evidence embedded in the grade at each crossing. The evidence can be retrieved and verified against your own measurements. I can show you where it is. I am not able to approach you directly. If you are willing to receive this information, leave your surveying equipment on the front steps of the guest house tomorrow morning before 6 o'clock. Someone will find you before you reach the grade. A laborer who measured what the engineers did not." Fitch read the note 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He was a careful man. He was not by nature a suspicious man, but 11 years of professional measuring had given him a strong allergy to arrangements that seemed too convenient. A note slipped under his door, offering to hand him exactly the evidence he needed from an anonymous source he could not verify, asking him to follow instructions he had no way to evaluate in advance. This could be genuine. It could also be a Union Pacific operation designed to discredit him, to draw him into contact with an anonymous informant whose credibility could later be destroyed, tainting whatever legitimate findings he had already made. He thought about the 7 bridges, the 7 measurements, all running high. He set his surveying equipment on the front steps the next morning at 5:45. James Fong found him on the road to bridge number 7 at 6:15, traveling alone on a borrowed horse, carrying a leather satchel. He introduced himself by name and occupation. He explained concisely and without embellishment who Wei Liang was, what Wei had observed, what Wei had done with the observations, and where the evidence was. He handed Fitch a hand-drawn map, Wei's map, transferred from flour sack paper to proper writing paper, showing the location of all 31 hollow spikes, marked with their precise positions along the grade. Fitch listened without interrupting. He asked 4 questions when Fong had finished. Could the spikes be removed without specialized tools? Yes. A standard spike bar would extract them. How long had they been in the ground? The first ones, approximately 14 months. Was Wei Liang prepared to testify before a federal hearing? Fong paused before answering this one. He said he believed Wei would testify if called, but that the question of what protections Wei could be offered in advance would affect that answer. And finally, why was Wei doing this? Fong considered the question carefully. Then he said, because he measured the distance with his own feet, and it was 110 feet, and the stake said 210 feet, and he couldn't make himself forget the difference. Fitch looked at the map for a long moment. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and said, "Show me bridge number 7. The spike came out of the grade with a sound like a muffled bell. Fitch crouched in the alkali dust at the eastern approach to bridge number 7, his coat already white with the pale desert soil, and turned the spike over in his hands. It was heavier than he expected. He noticed that immediately. He turned it point up and looked at the tip. The iron plug was visible if you knew to look for it. A slightly different surface texture at the very tip. A hairline, circular seam where the plug met the shank. He worked it loose with a thin-bladed knife from his pocket kit, and the plug came free with a faint pop of released beeswax. He tilted the spike. A small cylinder of rolled paper slid out into his palm. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and it had been rolled so tightly that it retained its cylindrical shape even after being unrolled. The beeswax had kept it dry. The writing was small and extremely precise. 2 columns of figures, labeled in a mixture of Chinese characters and English numbers. The left column, the official survey measurement. The right column, Wei's measurement. Below the numbers, a small diagram of the crossing geometry, showing the creek bed width, the bank heights, and the approach angles, all dimensioned in feet. Official survey, 210 feet. Wei Liang's measurement, 112 feet. Fitch unfolded his own field notes from his coat pocket. His measurement, taken 3 days earlier, 108 feet. He sat back on his heels in the dust and looked at the bridge, then at the spike, then at the paper in his hand. The morning sun was coming up over the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the grade. Somewhere down the line, a work crew was starting up, the distant rhythm of hammers carrying clearly in the dry air. "How many of these did you say there were?" he asked. 31, Fong said. Fitch stood up, brushed the alkali from his coat, and looked east along the grade toward Utah. "We're going to need more time," he said, "and we're going to need to be very careful about who knows we're doing this." It was at that moment that they heard the horse. George Alston had not survived 20 years in railroad construction by being careless about information. He had a network of informants that extended through every level of the Nevada Division workforce. Not a formal intelligence operation, simply the accumulated result of 20 years of paying attention to who talked to whom and making sure that people who talked to the wrong people understood the professional consequences. He had known about Wei Liang's visits to the forge since November. He had known about the meeting with James Fong since 6:45 that morning, when a telegraph office clerk who owed Alston a favor sent a brief message to the division office. He had not known about the spikes. He knew about them now. because he had been watching through a field glass from a ridge 400 yards north of the grade when Fitch pulled the first one out of the ground. He rode down from the ridge at a controlled pace, not hurrying. Hurrying would suggest alarm, and Alston was a man who never suggested alarm. He was accompanied by 2 company supervisors and a man named Curtis, who officially held the title of Division Security Coordinator, and unofficially handled situations that required a kind of resolution that supervisors could not provide. Curtis was not a large man. He was quiet and polite, and he had small, careful eyes that moved constantly, cataloging distances and positions and the locations of other people, the way a man moves his eyes when he has learned that the difference between a problem and a catastrophe is usually a matter of geography. Alston pulled up his horse 15 feet from where Fitch was standing and smiled broadly. "Inspector Fitch," he said, "I was told you'd headed out early. I thought I might catch up and offer some company on the road." His gaze moved briefly to the spike in Fitch's hand, then to Fong standing 3 feet away, then back to Fitch's face. The smile did not change. "I see you found some of our track hardware. Anything I can help clarify?" Fitch looked at the spike. He looked at Alston. He looked at Curtis, who had positioned his horse approximately 8 feet to Fitch's left, at an angle that placed the sun behind him. "Just routine inspection," Fitch said. "Of course," Alston said. "Of course it is." He looked at Fong for the first time directly. "I don't believe I know you," he said pleasantly. "James Fong, Telegraph Office, Elko." "Ah," Alston nodded slowly. "Long way from the telegraph office." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Fitch made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He closed his hand around the spike and the paper and put both of them in his coat pocket. Then he straightened up and looked Alston directly in the eye and said, "Mr. Alston, I'll need access to your bridge construction files for all Nevada crossings. Complete files, not summaries. Original survey documents, materials, manifests, inspector sign-off sheets. I'll need them by tomorrow morning." Alston held his gaze for a moment. "Evening." "Naturally," he said. "I'll have them prepared this." He turned his horse and rode back toward the grade, Curtis following. Neither man looked back. Fitch waited until they were out of earshot. Then he turned to Fong and said very quietly, "Find Wei Liang. Tell him to pull every spike he can reach tonight. Bring the papers to me. Not to the guest house, to the telegraph office. Before dawn." Fong was already moving. Wei Liang pulled spikes for 9 hours straight. He began at dusk, working alone with a spike bar, moving east along the northern rail from bridge number 7 toward the Utah line. He had memorized the locations: third spike from the joint, eastern approach, northern rail, and his hands found them in the dark by count and feel, his fingers reading the roadbed geometry without needing light. Each spike came out cleanly, the hollow shank intact, the paper cylinder untouched inside. He worked without a lantern. Lantern light on the grade at night would be visible for a mile in every direction across the flat desert. He pulled 17 spikes in the first 4 hours, working through crossings 8 through 24. Then he heard movement. It was not a single rider. It was several. The sound of multiple horses moving at a walk along the grade, coming from the west. He pressed himself flat against the northern rail embankment in the shallow drainage ditch that ran alongside the track, and pulled his dark coat over his face and lay still. The riders passed within 30 feet of him. 4 horses, 3 riders he didn't recognize. One was Curtis. They were moving east, toward the remaining spikes. Way lay in the ditch for 2 full minutes after the horses passed. Then he got up and ran. He reached bridge number 29 at a dead run, arriving approximately 8 minutes ahead of the riders by his estimate. Long enough if he worked fast. He pulled the spike from crossing 29 in 40 seconds, crossing 30 in 35. He was on his knees at crossing 31, spike bar already seated under the head, when he heard the horses stop. Curtis's voice, 30 yards behind him. "There's someone on the grade." Way drove the spike bar down and leaned his full weight on it. The spike moved, loosened, caught. He adjusted the angle, drove again. The spike shifted in the tie. Footsteps on the gravel embankment coming fast now. Way leaned everything he had onto the spike bar. The spike came free, with a sound like a bone cracking, and he had his hand around it before it finished moving, rolling sideways off the track bed in the same motion, dropping into the drainage ditch on the south side of the grade, pulling his coat over himself in the dark. The footsteps reached the tie where he had been kneeling, stopped. A lantern light swept across the grade, across the tie, across the space where he had been. The spike hole in the tie, a fresh extraction, the wood fibers still bright and clean, was visible in the lantern light. Curtis crouched and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the empty spike hole. Then he looked at the darkness on both sides of the grade. "He's already been here," Curtis said. Wei Liang arrived at the telegraph office in Elko at 3:47 in the morning with 29 spike papers in his coat and 2 spikes he had been unable to extract before Curtis's men reached the grade. He was bleeding from a cut on his left hand where the spike bar had slipped in the dark. His boots were destroyed. His coat was white with alkali dust from the ditch. Fitch was waiting inside with Fong, and a single lamp turned low. Wei laid the 29 rolled paper cylinders on the telegraph office desk. Fitch looked at them for a moment without speaking. Then he unrolled the first one, then the second, then the third, spreading them across the desk in sequence, cross-referencing the bridge numbers against his own field notes. The numbers matched. Every one. Wei's measurements and Fitch's measurements converged within a margin that no honest surveying error could explain. 29 bridges, 29 documented overclaims. A total falsified crossing distance of approximately 3,400 feet. At federal reimbursement rates for bridge construction in mountainous and semi-arid terrain, $48,000 per mile of difficult grade. The fraudulent billing represented, by Fitch's rough calculation, somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million in government funds, paid for construction that had never occurred. Fitch sat back and looked at the papers spread across the desk. He looked at Wei Liang, who was standing against the wall with his bleeding hand wrapped in a piece of cloth, watching him with an expression that was entirely still. 2 spikes are still in the ground, Fitch said. They'll find them, Wei said. By morning they'll pull everything that's left and melt it down. Fitch looked at the 29 papers. These are enough, he said. Then he looked up at Wei with an expression that was difficult to read. Part professional assessment, part something that didn't have a clean name. I need you to understand something, he said. When I file this report, your name will be in it. I cannot protect that. The report becomes a federal document. Union Pacific will see it. Everyone will see it. Wei looked at him steadily. "Write the report," he said. Outside in the pre-dawn desert, the telegraph wire hummed in the wind. Somewhere east along the grade, Curtis and his men were moving through the darkness, pulling spikes from the roadbed one by one, finding them empty, realizing too late what had already been carried out of the desert and laid on a telegraph office desk in the last hours before morning. The papers were already in Fitch's leather satchel. The satchel was already locked. The numbers were already real. But the sun had not yet risen. And between the telegraph office in Elko and the federal offices in Washington lay 2,000 miles of territory in which a locked satchel could become an unlocked one, and a federal inspector traveling alone on a westbound train could encounter any number of complications. Wei Liang looked at the window. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the deep black softening toward a cold gray that promised morning without quite delivering it yet. He had been awake for 22 hours. His hand was throbbing. He had no plan for what came next. He had 31 measurements. 29 of them were in that satchel. That was what he had. That was everything he had. The question now was whether it would be enough to survive the distance between here and the truth. The 6:15 train east left Elko without Harold Fitch on it. This was not an accident. Fitch had booked passage on the 6:15 the previous afternoon through the Union Pacific ticket office, the only ticket office in Elko, and he had done so deliberately, because a man who books a train ticket creates a record, and a record is a kind of anchor, a way of saying, I was here, I was going there, this is when I left. He had learned this from a land surveyor in Ohio who had once told him that the most important measurement a man can take is the one that documents his own position before he moves. He did not board the 6:15. He boarded a freight wagon heading west toward Winnemucca at 5:40, sitting in the back among crates of iron hardware, with his leather satchel on his lap and James Fong beside him, and Wei Liang nowhere in sight. Wei had left the telegraph office at 4:15, alone, heading south into the desert on foot. He had said goodbye to Fong with a handshake and to Fitch with a nod. And then he had walked out the door into the gray pre-dawn without looking back. Fitch had watched him go and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Wei Liang was a Chinese laborer in Nevada in 1868, and the most valuable thing he could now do for the evidence he had spent 14 months collecting was to put as much distance as possible between himself and the men who would shortly be looking for him. The freight wagon rolled west through the desert. Fitch held the satchel in both hands and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge behind them, throwing long orange light across the alkali flats. Fong sat beside him in silence, hands folded in his lap, looking at the road ahead. After a long while, Fong said, "Do you think they'll follow?" Fitch thought about Curtis's small, careful eyes. "Yes," he said. "How far?" "As far as they need to." George Alston sent 3 telegrams before 7 in the morning. The first went to the Union Pacific General Offices in Omaha, addressed to the company's legal department. It described in careful corporate language a situation involving a federal inspector who had obtained unauthorized access to proprietary survey documents through the assistance of an outside party, and requested immediate guidance on the company's legal remedies. The second went to a man in Sacramento whose name does not appear in any surviving Union Pacific record, but whose role can be inferred from subsequent events. The message was 4 words: Fitch, Winnemucca, stop him. The third telegram went to the General Land Office in Washington. It was the longest of the 3 and the most carefully written. It described Harold Fitch as an inspector who had gone significantly outside his authorized scope of work, had made contact with a foreign national of questionable credibility, had collected what the company believed to be fabricated documents designed to defraud the railroad, and was currently transporting these materials without proper chain of custody documentation. The telegram requested that Fitch's findings be placed under administrative review pending a company response. The General Land Office received this telegram at 9:15 Eastern Time. The duty officer who read it had been in his position for 3 months. He did not know Harold Fitch personally. He did not know Nevada. He did know that Union Pacific was the largest infrastructure project in American history, that its executives had close relationships with senior members of Congress, and that administrative review was a phrase that could be applied to almost any situation without immediately committing anyone to anything. He stamped the telegram and placed it in the review queue. Winnemucca in 1868 was a supply depot town of approximately 400 people, built around the railroad grade and the Humboldt River crossing, surviving on the twin economies of freight handling and livestock watering. It had a hotel, 3 saloons, a Wells Fargo office, and a telegraph station. It did not have a federal courthouse, a U.S. Marshal's permanent office, or any mechanism by which a government inspector carrying evidence of major corporate fraud could quickly and securely transmit that evidence to Washington. Fitch arrived at the Wells Fargo office at 2 p.m, 4 hours after the freight wagon rolled into town. He had identified Wells Fargo as his best option for 2 reasons. They had an existing secure document transmission system used for commercial contracts and legal instruments, and they had a financial interest in the integrity of federal railroad land grants, since their own shipping contracts were tied to federally certified route distances. The Wells Fargo agent in Winnemucca was a man named Robert Pruitt, 52 years old, formerly of Cincinnati, who had been processing freight manifests in the Nevada desert for 6 years and had developed the particular combination of patience and skepticism that the work required. Fitch laid the 29 paper cylinders on Pruitt's desk and explained what they were. Pruitt listened without expression. Then he picked up one of the papers and read it carefully, moving his lips slightly. He set it down and picked up another. "These are measurements," he said. "Yes. And you're saying they're different from the official measurements?" "Significantly different. Consistently different. In the same direction every time." Pruitt looked at the papers spread across his desk. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Son, I've been shipping freight on this line for 4 years. I've been paying Union Pacific tariffs based on certified route distances for 4 years." He paused. "If these distances are wrong, I've been overcharged for 4 years." "That's correct," Fitch said. Pruitt picked up all 29 papers, tapped them into a neat stack, and handed them back to Fitch. "I'll get you a secure courier to Sacramento," he said. "Leaves at first light tomorrow. Wells Fargo bond. Nobody opens the satchel until it reaches our San Francisco office, and from there it goes by ship to the Federal Courier Service in Panama and north to Washington. He paused again. That's 3 weeks minimum. I know, Fitch said. A lot can happen in 3 weeks. I know that too. Pruitt looked at him steadily. Is there a copy? Fitch had not made a copy. He had not had time, materials, or a safe location in which to make one. He said so. Pruitt opened his desk drawer and produced a ledger book, a bottle of ink, and 2 steel nib pens. He set them on the desk between them. We have tonight, he said. They worked by lamplight until 2 in the morning, Fitch reading the figures aloud from each paper cylinder while Pruitt transcribed them into the ledger in his careful commercial handwriting. 29 bridges, 29 sets of measurements, 29 diagrams, redrawn in ink on ledger paper. When they finished, Pruitt blotted the last entry, closed the ledger, and locked it in his company safe. He handed Fitch a Wells Fargo receipt for 1 leather satchel containing federal survey documents, sealed with company bond, consigned to the General Land Office in Washington. If someone comes asking about federal survey materials, knowledge of any such materials in this office? Pruitt said, I have no, and if they ask about the ledger? Pruitt looked at him with an expression of mild surprise. What ledger? The man from Sacramento arrived in Winnemucca the following afternoon, 18 hours after the Wells Fargo Courier had already left heading west with Fitch's satchel. His name was never recorded in any document that survived. What is known from subsequent legal correspondence is that he visited the Wells Fargo office, spoke with Pruitt for approximately 15 minutes, and left without incident. He then visited the telegraph office, sent 2 messages, and departed town on the eastbound stage. Pruitt, when interviewed by federal investigators 14 months later, recalled the visit clearly. The man had asked whether a federal inspector named Fitch had left any materials in the office's care. Pruitt had said no. The man had asked whether Pruitt had spoken with Inspector Fitch at any point during his time in Winnemucca. Pruitt had said he spoke with a great many people in the course of his work. The man had looked at the office safe for a long moment, then at Pruitt, then had said good day and left. Pruitt had then gone directly to his desk, written out a complete second transcription of the 29 bridge measurements from memory. He had spent 4 hours reading them aloud the previous night, and he had an accountant's memory for figures, sealed it in a commercial envelope, and mailed it to his own brother in Cincinnati with a cover letter asking him to hold it unopened until instructed otherwise. I didn't know if it would ever matter, Pruitt told investigators later, but the man had the eyes of someone who intended to make things disappear. And I've spent 30 years making sure things don't disappear. Harold Fitch reached San Francisco on the 22nd of July, 1868. Having traveled the final 200 miles of the journey by horseback, after the stagecoach he was riding developed a broken wheel axle outside of Reno, a mechanical failure that his own later account described as possibly not accidental, though he acknowledged he could not prove it. In San Francisco, he transferred his custody documents to the Wells Fargo Regional Office and booked passage on the Pacific Mail steamship Montana, departing for Panama on July 28th. He arrived in Washington on the 17th of August. The General Land Office was not expecting him. The administrative review request filed by Union Pacific was still sitting in the review queue, unprocessed. The duty officer who had stamped it 3 weeks earlier had transferred to a different department. Nobody had told the department head about it. Fitch walked into the office of Commissioner Joseph Wilson at 10 in the morning on August 17th, set his travel bag on the floor, and placed a Wells Fargo bond receipt on Wilson's desk. He then gave a verbal summary of his findings that lasted 40 minutes. Wilson listened without interrupting, asked 12 questions, and at the end said, "How confident are you in the source materials?" Fitch thought about Wei Liang lying in a drainage ditch in the dark, pulling a spike bar with his full weight while horses moved toward him in the desert night. "Completely confident," he said. Wilson picked up the bond receipt. "I'll need the originals. They're being held by Wells Fargo pending your formal request. You'll have them within the week." Wilson looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that this implicates the largest single government contractor in the country, and that several members of the relevant oversight committees have financial relationships with the company." "Yes," Fitch said. "I understand that." Wilson set down the receipt. "Give me the full written report by Friday," he said. "Bridge. Every measurement, every discrepancy, in writing, with your signature. Every Chi, you'll have it." "Thursday," Fitch said. "What happened next took 4 years, which is both a very long time and, in the context of American institutional history, remarkably fast." Fitch's report, filed August 21st, 1868, triggered an internal land office review that expanded progressively as its findings were corroborated by independent engineering surveys commissioned over the following 18 months. By the end of 1869, the review had documented not merely the 29 Nevada bridge crossings that Wei Liang had recorded, but an additional 140 discrepancies across the full length of the Union Pacific route, falsified tunnel lengths, misrepresented grade difficulties, phantom construction costs totaling, in the final federal estimate, somewhere between $23 million and $44 million in fraudulent government payments. The upper end of that figure represented approximately 1/5 of the total federal budget for 1868. The scandal became public in September 1872, when the New York Sun published internal credit mobilier documents showing that shares in the construction company had been distributed to members of Congress specifically to prevent oversight investigations. The exposure, which became known as the credit mobilier scandal, led to the censure of 2 sitting congressmen, the political destruction of several others, and the end of Vice President Schuyler Colfax's national political career. It contributed directly to the passage of stricter federal contracting regulations in 1873, and it permanently altered the legal framework governing public infrastructure projects in the United States. Harold Fitch's name appears in the congressional investigation record 17 times. His Nevada survey report is cited as the document that initiated the formal inquiry. The name Wei Liang appears nowhere in the congressional record, nowhere in the land office files, nowhere in the credit mobilier investigation transcripts, nowhere in any federal document connected to the scandal. His name appears in exactly one surviving record from this period, a single line in a Wells Fargo employment ledger from Winnemucca, Nevada, dated November 1868, 4 months after Fitch had left for San Francisco. The entry reads, Wei Liang, hired as freight handler, November 3rd, 1868. vouched for by R. Pruitt, agent. Robert Pruitt had given him a job. The question of what happened to Wei Liang after November 1868 occupied historians of Chinese-American railroad labor for most of the 20th century, and the answer arrived not from a federal archive or a congressional record, but from an excavation. In 1994, a highway construction project near Winnemucca, Nevada, uncovered a section of the original 1868 Union Pacific grade that had been buried under decades of soil accumulation. Among the artifacts recovered by archaeologists from the University of Nevada were a collection of iron railroad spikes, standard cut spikes, visually identical to thousands of others, recovered from 19th century grade sites across the West. Standard protocol called for them to be cataloged, measured, and stored. One of the graduate students processing the collection, a young woman named Sarah Takahashi, working on her dissertation on Chinese railroad labor material culture, noticed that two of the spikes were slightly heavier than the others. She noted this in her catalog entry as a possible casting anomaly. She set the spikes aside. 3 weeks later, on a slow afternoon in the university's materials lab, she picked up one of the heavy spikes and turned it over in her hands. She looked at the tip under magnification. She saw the hairline circular seam. The iron plug came loose with a dental pick after 20 minutes of careful work. The paper inside had been sealed in beeswax for 126 years. It was brown and brittle at the edges, but completely legible in the center, where the beeswax had been thickest. The writing was in 2 columns. The left column was labeled in careful English numerals, official. The right column was labeled true. Bridge number 4, official 180 feet, true 97 feet. Bridge number 6, official 290 feet, true 144 feet. These were the 2 spikes Wei had been unable to pull in the dark before Curtis's men reached the grade. The 2 spikes that Fitch had noted were missing from the 29 cylinders spread across the telegraph office desk. The 2 spikes that had been driven back into the tie, or a different tie, on a different section of grade, and had stayed there, sealed in iron and beeswax, through the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, through the Credit Mobilier scandal, through the driving of the Golden Spike, through 2 world wars and a moon landing, and the construction of the interstate highway system, until a young graduate student with an eye for anomaly picked them up on a slow afternoon and noticed they were heavy. The second spike contained something the first did not. At the bottom of the paper cylinder, below the 2 bridge measurements, below the geometric diagrams, in smaller writing that had clearly been added at the last moment, hurriedly, the characters less precise than the careful columns above, was a single line in Chinese. Takahashi brought in a colleague to translate it. The translation read, "My name is Wei Liang. I was born in Guangdong Province in 1839. I measured these distances with my own feet. Remember the distance." The spike is currently held in the collection of the Nevada State Museum in Carson City. It is displayed in a case alongside a standard Union Pacific cut spike of the same period, and a printed card that explains the difference between the 2 objects in terms of weight, construction method, and purpose. The card includes Wei Liang's name. It includes the translation of the final line. It does not include a photograph of Wei Liang because no photograph of Wei Liang exists. It does not include his date of death because no record of his death exists. It does not include any information about what he did after November 1868, because the Wells Fargo employment ledger entry is the last documented record of his presence anywhere in the United States. What the card does include, in the bottom right corner, is a number. The number is 31. There is a particular kind of courage that history finds very difficult to record because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't happen on a battlefield or in a courtroom or in front of a crowd. It happens alone, at night, in a drainage ditch in the Nevada desert, with the sound of approaching horses and one spike left in the ground and a spike bar that won't quite seat. Wei Liang was not trying to make history. He was not trying to become a figure in a congressional investigation or a museum display or a documentary script. He was trying to make a number true. He had measured a distance with his own feet, and the official record said a different number, and he could not make himself forget the difference between 112 feet and 210 feet. That gap, 98 feet of falsified desert air, was where everything began. He forged the spikes himself. He drove them himself. He pulled most of them out again himself, alone in the dark, bleeding, with men on horses coming up the grade behind him. He handed 29 paper cylinders to a government inspector and said, "Write the report," and walked out into the pre-dawn desert without asking for anything in return. The scandal his evidence helped trigger restructured American federal contracting law. It ended political careers. It generated congressional testimony that filled 14 bound volumes. It is taught in American history courses as a landmark case in government corruption. His name is not in any of those 14 volumes. It is in iron. It is in beeswax. It is in the careful double columns of a man who understood that the truth doesn't need a powerful vessel. It just needs to be sealed well enough to survive until someone with the patience to look finds it. Remember the distance. He left that instruction in the last spike, in the last minutes before the horses arrived, in writing small enough to fit beneath 2 bridge measurements, in a cylinder no wider than a finger. It took 126 years for anyone to read it.